Hi, Kibbe. It's Chris. This is for December 27th, the last Sunday of the year. And I would like to, you can see behind me, we have gotten some snow. Uh, it takes pretty specific conditions for snow to happen. That's why, the last couple of weeks has been plenty cold enough for snow. But snow requires a mix of air temperature, moisture content, moisture interacting with that piece of air and certain types of clouds or whatever. And if you don't have those conditions, then you don't get snow. I'd like to look at Matthew 14, which is a story about Jesus walking to the disciples and then him calling Peter out of the boat. And I'd like to look at, what are the necessary conditions for miracles to occur? So I'm going to read. It's Matthew 14, 22 through 33, and then pray, and then we'll dive in and try not to restart this video again. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat, go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the land. It was battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, that's somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., Jesus came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said to Peter, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, took hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." Let's ask this passage some questions. What are the necessary conditions for a miracle to occur? Because we have a story here about a miracle occurring. Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water. And it's kind of almost an arbitrary miracle, isn't it? He's not saving anyone's life. This is just to encourage or give resolution to this terror they have that he's a ghost. And so Peter says to Jesus, "Call me out." And Jesus says, "Come." And then a miracle happens, right? So now we're going to ask the text a couple questions. What's the necessary ingredient for a miracle? Is it circumstances, right? Because we have in this story, there's circumstances that led to this miracle, right? We have the storm coming in. The disciples were alone. They didn't have Jesus with them. They'd been in this storm for a long time. You could tell they're kind of in the commentary that it's not looking good for them. And here they see something walking across the water, and they're terrified. So you got all these circumstances. Are the circumstances what are a necessary ingredient for a miracle? I would say no, just for the sake of moving through this, and there's nobody here to argue with me until somebody walks by again. No, ingredients aren't necessary. Think about it this way. When I make a plan and prepare for an event with my students, I have to have a lot of contingency plans, right? If such and such happens, this is what I'm going to have to do. If such and such happens, and some of those contingency plans require me to operate at a very high level of exertion or awareness or attention to detail. And depending on what's happening, depending on the circumstances, I have to deploy one of those plans. But the reason I need contingencies, right, which in this story, the miracle would be the contingency. The reason I need contingencies is, one, because I don't know what will happen. And so I do my best. And number two, I don't plan very well. So if the circumstances of a miracle are a necessary part of that miracle, that does kind of lend this idea that God's not really in control. He's not planning very well. And that's why he occasionally has to dig deep and do something miraculous. And you can see that that's not a necessary uh, ingredient to a miracle. It is an ingredient in this story. The circumstances are a necessary ingredient, but they're not a critical component, right? Because if something like this had happened and they were in a desert, there's not really a need for that. So, an important part, not to be overlooked, but is it the critical ingredient for miracle? We would say, no, it's not the circumstances. God's not run by circumstances. And by natural extension of that, if you are looking for God to do something great in your life, interact with somebody, come through in something like this, and what you're bringing is a detailed description of circumstances, as though he didn't know, and now that he knows, he'll begin to move. You can understand there's some flawed theology behind that, and maybe just let that go. Jesus knew this storm was coming. He intentionally sent them. He didn't make them wait for him. He intentionally sent them to create the conditions for this miracle to happen. But the conditions were not an essential part of the miracle. So, circumstances, no, we'll cut that out. What's the next thing? Was it, so here's one for you. Was it the initiative of Peter? Is human initiative a critical component for a miracle to happen? Because you see here, you hear the old adage, right? That's kind of what ultimately got me started thinking about this story. You've heard it said before: if you want to walk on water, what? You got to get out of the boat. What part of Peter's initiative in this played into this miracle happening? Was it an essential part? Was it Peter taking the bull by the horns, and because he did something, then God responded by doing a miracle? And you can see some examples of this through the Old Testament with some of the old patriarchs of the faith and their big prayers, like Moses and like Abraham. And it seems like that initiative is important, but is our initiative an essential ingredient in miracles happening? And a quick look through the Gospels shows no. There's a lot of stories of Jesus doing a great miracle and nobody came to him and said, do this miracle. You do have ones, like Mary at the wedding, where Jesus responds to somebody bringing something up. But then you also have the story just before this, where the feeding of the 5,000. Nobody said, hey, Jesus, why don't you split up these bread and feed everybody? He was the one who took the initiative and said, let's give them something to eat. And so human initiative, while in this story, is a real ingredient. Human initiative is not the essential component. Now, let's move to the third. Faith. Because, this story has faith in it, right? Peter trusting Christ, and at the end of it, he questions because Peter began to sink because of his lack of faith and his doubting. Is faith an essential component to miracles happening? Now, there's kind of some nuance here, because in a very real sense, yes, faith is a critical component to miracles. But let's clarify, what do you mean by faith here? Because right now I'm sitting in the Black River Preserve. I'm sitting on a bench, right? That's a 4x4 treated post for the horizontal slats, and it's got metal legs cemented into the ground, and I'm fairly certain it'll hold up my bulking mass by the looks of it. And then when I sat down on it, I trusted. I had faith. Is that what it's talking about? Is it faith in God? When he says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, say to this mountain, be cast into the sea, and it'll be done. Is the reason that's not happening because you have no faith? Or because faith is a little bit more complicated than that? And even Peter's faith here has to do with a response. So here's what I'd like you to try on. Faith is a trusting response to the promise of God, right? So faith is not a magical lever that we can use to twist God's arm and make him do what we want to do. Faith is not this mystical power that we have on our own that can somehow do these miraculous things without God. Faith is responding in trust to God, to Christ, right? And so that is not anything that can exist on its own, right? And so we get into the last. So faith, while it was an ingredient, faith is not the critical ingredient in every miracle that ever happens. There's a lot of miracles that happen and the person had no ability to use faith, to have faith. Story of Lazarus. The sisters trusted. Lazarus did not. He wasn't there. He wasn't in a spot where he could have faith. In many of the Old Testament stories, like with Abraham, Abraham didn't trust that God would do this specific thing, but he just trusted that God was incredibly powerful and had the ability to carry out his promises. So even his trust wasn't this mystical thing that existed in him isolated from anything. Faith is a response. It's a trusting response to God's promise and his presence. And that's what we see here. So then that leads us into the last question. So what is, we're kind of stripping away all these details of the story, what is the critical, essential element of a miracle? And we see it in the story. Like, when did the miracle happen? Fixing my collar. It's been messed up now for 12 minutes. When did the miracle happen? So if we read through the story, the miracle happened in response to Christ's command, right? If you want to walk on water, you got to jump out of the boat. You know what? Go find yourself a boat. You're going to learn a really good lesson this time of year. If you want to walk on water, go find yourself a boat and jump out of it. You know what's going to happen? You're going to land in very cold water, right? But when the command of Christ, when the invitation, when the challenge that Christ gave to Peter, as it approached Peter, all the conditions for a miracle to occur were right there at the command of Christ. Because when the command of Christ goes out, everything is met. There's nothing else that needs to happen. And so we read in the story of Lazarus, Jesus calls out to a corpse in a tomb, dead 3 days, and he speaks a word to be obeyed, and that word goes out with a power and creates all the conditions necessary for a miracle to occur. Think about that. Chew on that for a bit. There's some pretty significant implications. If miracles happen as we obey the word of Christ, then it becomes increasingly more and more important to do what Christ says. Are you looking for a miracle to happen? Do you need a miracle to happen? Do you also have a command of Christ that you are resisting obeying? Well, it's right there. All you got to do is do it, right? And as we reflect on this reality, we see there's some pretty staggering implications. It's not just a willy-nilly thing. We don't do it just because we like him. It is utterly, absolutely necessary for you to take every word of Christ dead serious. Because miracles, as Christ's word comes to you, miracles are coming to you. He is changing this world in response to his words being obeyed. Just like in this story, they're all ready to happen. All the conditions are met, and all it takes is for that word to come in and for you to obey it, and then the miracle is there. Think about that. Chew on that for a bit. But as I reflected on this, it became evident to me that what's going on, why is it the commands of Christ? As we read through this, the commands of Christ represent these two great things. First, it represents his presence, right? As Christ drew near, that's when the command came out. And so we can assure ourselves that when Christ is speaking to us, inviting us into his work, challenging us, daring us, asking us to take risks in response to what he's doing in this world, that is Christ. That is the person of Christ. When you imagine God as some sort of force or impersonal thing, and demands and obligations come out of that, you can see how it's like, that I'm all alone, and all I'm being given is instruction from a distance, right? Somebody text messaging you things to do. But the commands of Christ are the presence of Christ, like a person, like a friend who draws near. And part of the implications of him drawing near is it makes demands on you, right? If I'm sharing an office with somebody, there's certain things I'm naturally going to do that just consider the presence of a person that I'm in close contact with. And the commands of Christ, while they are a miracle drawing near, the commands of Christ are a miracle because they are the presence of Christ drawing near. And here's another interesting thing that's going to be a challenge. All the commands of Christ demand the cross. Because in this passage, there's two commands, right? The one to Peter is the second one. The first command in this passage is this: as he walks up, he says, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, this is in the gospel, which is Jesus in the flesh, right? Tabernacling among us, God with us. And so because it's the gospel, there's a forest there, and sometimes it's hard to miss. How does that go? We'll miss a tree. The tree is for the forest, or the forest for I don't know. You have a story, right? The gospel narratives, and it's got Jesus drawing near, Jesus doing stuff, Jesus close with people. And sometimes I think it's hard, or it's difficult to stop and think, what does that mean? This is God, perfectly just, perfectly righteous, perfectly holy, who is drawing near to sinful, broken people. Justice demands he do something about their sinful state. And yet the gospel is story after story after story of him drawing near. And even in this first command of Christ, he says, "It's me. Don't be afraid." Right? Even the command to Peter, what's the command to Peter? Come here. Come here. He's drawing sinful people near whose faith has faults in it that causes him to sink. He's drawing near to sinful people who think that the God of the universe coming to them is a ghost, and he terrifies them. Broken people. And yet Christ is always drawing near. And the story of the Gospels is the reason he draws near like that is because he has satisfied justice with the cross. So even as he says to Peter, "Come here," Peter can't come here on his own. The only way he can come to Christ, to close to Christ, is because Christ is going to the cross. The only reason he can say to them, "It's me, don't be afraid," is because he's going to the cross. So every command of Christ not only represents or manifests the presence of Christ, but every demand of Christ, every instruction, every command of Christ is an expression of the cross. Because a miracle can't happen unless something is done about our sinful state. And that's what he's done on the cross. So that's why commands can be miracles like this. So, yep, that's it. That's what I got. So think about, I've got something else, an example. So here we are, 20 minutes now, and here's my example. If we were to watch, because, it's the last Sunday of the month, which means these shows are going to come on, the year in review. 2020 year in review is going to have to be something dumpster fire themed, because this has been a dumpster fire of a year. And as I say that, even now, I think, but I'm sure there are people that have fallen in love this year, gotten married, people that have had, I know people who've had babies. And so, it's not, it's face masks. I'm sorry. It's fear and it's face masks. And my gym closed. And those three things work together to make me think this was a dumpster fire year. And so maybe I should just stop now. But I'll keep going. This is my last week for a bit. So, in this dumpster fire of a year, it is very easy to give in. I talked about this a little bit last week. It's easy to give in to the fear, the panic, the sort of overreaching, over-controlling characteristic, because so much is changing and you just need to be in control of something. And if that means you have to steamroll some people, then so be it, as long as you're in control. 1 Peter has a command from Christ. And that command goes this way. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? So there it is. There's your challenge. As people begin to panic and begin to demand attention, demand you cater to their fears, there is a tendency, I have a tendency, to say something along the lines of, well, I don't care about your fears, I'm going to do my thing. But you see, that's just continuing the pattern. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? That is a command of Christ that I can tell you, I can bear witness to you, that as you inhabit a command of Christ, to continue serving, to continue showing grace, even in the midst of abject fear, to serve and to be a calm, encouraging presence in that, it creates miracles. So a miracle is drawing near in interpersonal relationships, far greater than walking on, because let's be honest, I mean, as cool as walking on water is, unless you want to cross a stream and not get your feet wet, it's not the most useful of miracles. But I'll tell you this, to be Christ, encouraging and showing grace and serving and transforming people by your gracious presence, that's a miracle. But that's a miracle that demanded the cross. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? Do you know what the cross was? It was the God of the universe being wronged, being defrauded, and bearing that. And by bearing that and continuing to show grace and love, he transformed everything. So there's your example. The command of Christ is everything. It is all the conditions for a miracle that can transform not just one guy walking on some water in a storm, but it can transform you in the midst of this storm, 2020, and then on into 2021. But let's not ruin 2021. That you can walk in this storm in a way that transforms everything. As you receive the word of Christ and as you do it and experience not just a miracle, but experience and bear witness to the cross. In closing, there's a great quote from C.S. Lewis at the end of The Weight of Glory, and it's kind of fitting for this. He says, "But the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow is a Monday morning." I love that line. Then he says, "A gap has opened up in the pitiless walls of this world, and our great captain beckons us to follow him inside. The following, of course, is the most essential point." Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for the miracles that you are working through us as we take your word seriously and become embodiments of the gospel, the cross, the presence of Christ, and transform this world the way he did. We thank you for that, and we pray that you'd bless us as we move this week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.